Here I make an appeal to everyone on the political right, which I will define later, to cease attacking homosexual individuals as immoral, obscene, vicious, flawed, self-destructive, or unnatural. Furthermore, while I denounce any governmental conferment of special privilege upon any group whatsoever, I also urge a cessation of all attempts to render homosexuals less legally protected in their basic individual rights than any other person. I make this appeal as a highly socially conservative heterosexual who has the utmost respect for the institution of marriage as traditionally defined. I have, too, in the past, argued a comparatively moderate position in criticism of homosexuality. While I did not consider homosexuals evil or deserving of hatred or insults, I did believe that homosexual behaviors and their open manifestation were more harmful than restraint from such behaviors and manifestations. Thus, I urged homosexuals themselves to confine themselves to the closet, or to actively resist whatever temptations they might have had. Also, while I never advocated anti-sodomy laws or legal restrictions on the rights of homosexuals, I did wish to keep the term marriage confined to a union between one man and one woman, while extending full civil unions to homosexual couples. These earlier positions of mine were expressed in my essays Homosexuality, a Chosen Harm, and A Rational Defense of Marriage. I no longer hold the positions described above, and I believe that any future public blanket criticism of homosexuals, however well-intentioned such criticism might be, will do far more harm than good. Moreover, I urge the withdrawal of all objections to homosexual marriage or open manifestations of homosexual preferences, provided that these manifestations are done civilly and in accord with the same expectations of good taste as accompany manifestations of heterosexual preference. I address this essay to the political right, broadly defined. The right consists of all persons calling themselves conservatives, libertarians, objectivists, anarcho-capitalists, constitutionalists, traditionalists, federalists, or any combination of the above. Some of these individuals have already come to terms with the relatively recent open manifestations of homosexuality in Western societies, but many on the right have yet to recognize that these open manifestations are a highly welcome development and will actually be conducive to the increased prevalence of moral behavior. I hope to outline here some of the arguments that helped me arrive at this conclusion. My first argument is that every homosexual is an individual and should be judged accordingly. Most of us would agree that it would be absurd to judge or form even a semi-complete impression of a heterosexual person solely on the basis of his or her preferences and relationships in the sexual realm. There is far more to a person than sexual orientation, and most of a person's everyday public dealings, conversations, interests, and pursuits have nothing to do with sexuality. What is true of heterosexuals is equally true of homosexuals. By thinking of homosexuals simply in terms of what they do in their bedrooms, which we should not be thinking about anyway out of respect for their privacy, we neglect to consider the individuality of each self-proclaimed homosexual. Many of these individuals may be highly intelligent, productive, and friendly. They might have values to offer us which we would gladly accept for their own sake, values that have nothing to do with what goes on in any bedroom in any part of the world. To reject productive exchanges of material, intellectual, and emotional values based on considerations that are tangential at most, such as sexuality, is self-destructive on the part of those undertaking such a rejection. Moreover, while the best evidence available to me suggests that certain homosexual practices pose a risk to individual health, this is also true of certain heterosexual practices, and the dangerous practices in question are performed by heterosexuals perhaps as often as they are performed by homosexuals. To condemn homosexuality per se on this basis is unwarranted, as such a condemnation would once again neglect the individuality of every homosexual. After all, each homosexual is a thinking, rational being who is capable of using his or her own discretion to determine which practices are risky and which are not, and to choose practices to maximize his or her own expected longevity. I do not prescribe what those choices ought to be, as I simply do not know enough particulars of any given person's situation and do not care to intrude. But the assumption that every homosexual necessarily engages in self-destructive behavior neglects to consider the context of every individual homosexual's situation. Certainly, some homosexuals do behave in ways destructive of their own health, but so do many heterosexuals, and this is not to be taken as a criticism of all individuals with these sexual preferences. Just as it would be absurd to condemn all alcohol drinkers just because some drink to the detriment of their health, so it would be incorrect to suggest that all homosexuals disregard their health and physical well-being. Responsible homosexuals are likely as prevalent among the homosexual population as are social drinkers among the alcohol-consuming population. It is the irresponsibility that needs to be discouraged, not the homosexuality or the consumption of alcohol. There are two ways to discourage irresponsibility. One is in the general philosophical sense, recognizing why irresponsibility as an abstract idea is undesirable in all cases where it exists. The other is a recognition of a specific instance of irresponsibility as demonstrated by a specific individual's actions. Neither allows condemnation of a whole broad group of people or a whole class of behaviors without unambiguous evidence that all the behaviors condemned are in fact irresponsible. This is evidence that none of us may have, as it would involve knowledge of the details of every homosexual's personal life. Such knowledge would overwhelm even the greatest busybodies by its sheer volume. Thus, instead of judging people as homosexuals or heterosexuals, it is far more reasonable to judge them as individuals, based on all the publicly known dimensions of their lives. There are certainly some homosexuals who are highly unpleasant, and even evil in their behaviors. But this is also true of some members of any group of individuals defined on a racial, cultural, ethnic, professional, philosophical, religious, or political basis. The fact that the world is peppered with bad people does not justify per se condemnation of homosexuality.